So when we're talking about data in general, the first thing that you need to understand and kind of like um, define is the term data itself. So when it comes to the term data, it means any sort of information that allows the business to function. So what I mean by information is if you're a hospital, it would be patient files, right? If you're a company that is using customer information to sell things, well, then it would be customer information. If you're a school, well, then it would be student records, it would be class scores, it would be things such as the student's medical information or the student's grades. There's a lot of data protection when it comes to students nowadays, even for family and parents and whatnot. The students still have a lot of protection. The entire goal with data here is that it lies at the center of any business that's trying to operate. What I mean by that is without that data, the business would be crippled. That data fuels all of the actions. Whatever business you have, whatever business you are, the data is what is essentially going to help your business succeed or help it kind of build off of it. That's why data protection is really important. Data protection is the art of making sure that your information or your assets that you're using, that it stays safe, that no one accesses it to it, that it is not lost at all, and that it's not damaged at all. As you can imagine, that complies with the CIA triad: confidentiality, integrity, availability. When I mean not being lost. That stands for availability. It not being accessed. That means confidentiality. And it not being damaged or changed. That means integrity. So the CIA triad, I think someone mentioned that in their answers, is definitely part of that. Something like Aiden said, credentials for accounts and financial information is very accurate because, as you can imagine, that type of data, if it gets in the hands of a threat actor, it becomes a really big problem for the organization. Because with those credentials, a student or a threat actor can cause a lot of headaches and they can cause a lot of harm. So, this lesson, we're essentially going to talk about some of the important aspects of data protection. We're going to talk about how backups play a part in data protection. Then we're also going to talk about why it's important. I'll give you in a nutshell. It's important for three main reasons. The first one is because when when you lose data or if your data is not well protected, you're actually in breach of several compliance standards as well as some legal requirements. That's why GDPR exists. That's why CCPA exists. It is all meant to protect you, the end user's data. Now, if you're in breach of those, well, then the second thing is you tend to lose trust. When you lose trust, well, then your stakeholders, your board of directors, they start to wonder if you can still function or work through that. Okay. Like I mentioned, GDPR here. And one of the last ones is business continuity. We talked about that a little bit in our last class where I brought up disaster recovery as well as business continuity planning. That stands for BCP. BCP is business continuity planning, and it's essentially making sure that your business is still able to function in the event of a disaster. Data protection is part of the BCP. Now, I do want to mention that when it comes to data protection, it is a whole other ball game because yes, it does fall under cybersecurity and it does fall under business continuity, but there is a line of cybersecurity that's essentially revolved around privacy. That's its own separate entity. Okay. So those are the things that we're going to be talking about today is why data protection is important, how backups work, and kind of dive a little deeper into all of those. Okay? Mm, okay. All right. So let's start with one question. What is data protection? So, like I mentioned before, data protection is centered around making sure the information that you use in order to make sure that your company still functions is still able to be accessed, that it is accessed only by those who need access to it, and there is no amendment. It is the entire practice of safeguarding the important information that keeps your company running. You're protecting that information from potential corruption, potential loss, or potential unauthorized use. That's the very definition of data protection. Now, data protection in and of itself is an incredibly important part of information security because it's not just something that is technical in nature, it is also something that has legal and ethical priorities. This is one of the reasons why I brought up the humanity of cybersecurity. Is cybersecurity a technical industry? Yes, it is. But another part of it is actually soft skills. A part of a soft skill is being an ethical person. This is actually why a lot of people do interviews so that they can ask someone questions and see if they're going to be telling the truth or not. Fun fact. When you interview at different companies, they already know some of the information about you and they're checking if you're going to lie to them or not. This is an ethics tactic. A very simple one is asking, do you have any experience with this tool? They ask you that because they want to see if you're going to say yes or no based on what you said in your resume, or even worse, based on what you said on social media. Like I said before, you want as a cybersecurity professional, you want to make sure you're aware of your digital footprint because that is literally what companies are looking for. Hear me when I say this. Anyone can learn how to do cybersecurity, but it is rarely possible to teach someone ethics. You work in cybersecurity, which means that you are going to be dealing with a lot of sensitive and important data, which means that you need to have an ethical character in order to do it well. That is why I say that data protection is not just technical, it's not just something that is legal, but it's something that is ethical as well. So, how exactly does data protection work? Well, it falls under a multitude of different categories because data protection is layered, I would say. What do I mean by layered? Well, data protection involves trying to protect A from unauthorized access. That's one of the first things you want to do is you want to protect it from unauthorized access and make sure that it's very difficult for any threat actor to get that information. All right. You also want to make sure you protect it against the new threats that exist in the industry. The threats that exist in the industry include things like malware, ransomware. It can include things such as like new hacks that are coming out that are specifically targeting data centers and data servers and whatnot. I saw some people say data servers and data centers when I asked, what is your view of data? That's absolutely accurate because data is any information that may live in one specific location. That's why data centers exist. Okay, so if we're trying to protect that data, right? Well, then one of the first things that you can do is something called encryption. We've talked about this in class before, but in short, encryption, if you're ever going to think of an easy way to explain it, the way that I like to explain it to my mom, specifically my mom, is I say encryption is just turning something that is human readable to something completely unreadable. It makes it just a bunch of jumbles of letters and whatnot because then humans can't actually read it. If you think about data, right, data has to be understood. Understood means that it needs to speak the language as the person that's reading it. If you obfuscate that data, obfuscate is another way to say kind of like hide it. If you obfuscate that data or make it encrypted, well, then it becomes unreadable unless you have a special key. It's like if I were to say, you all know some of those fancy doors where if you turn the knob, well then it becomes gray and you can't see it. Well then when you turn it again, it becomes completely clear. That's like what the key does. It essentially makes it clear and readable if you have the key to unlock the encryption. Now, that's a protection level that's very foundational. A lot of companies already do this, and they should. The next one is access control. Now, access control is just making sure that only the right people can see and edit certain information. If you were to do this in your own life, in your own personal life, think of it this way. Access control means that only you have access to your bank account, only you have access to your email, and only you have access to your phone. The way you protect all of these are things such, the most common reason, the common way is through a password, a username and password. Username and password is a form of access control because it defines it completely. It just means having a control that allows or denies someone access to a very specific resource. In this case, it's data. Now, access control can be multiple things. We'll talk about this later on in class, but it can be something as a password. It can be, if you have your phone, it can be your Face ID, or it can be a fingerprint, right? All of these are different ways that you can authenticate who you are, and then we'll see if you're authorized to actually access something. If you remember the AAA triad or the AAA, let's go ahead and test that knowledge. What does AAA stand for? Go ahead and comment in that thread. What does AAA stand for? Now, given the topic that we're talking about, hopefully it comes to mind. This is something that you do have to memorize on top of the CIA triad, so highly encourage you to do so. And the answers are coming in. There we go. Authentication, authorization, and accounting. Very well done. That is completely accurate. That is a part of access control. Very, very well done. So, in addition to access control, you also need to have backups and recovery. We talked about this last class as well. Backups and recovery is essentially making sure that you have copies of your data in case one site location or one data center goes down. So you need to make sure that you have backups in order to bring it back up. This is called redundancy. After that, we also have data masking. Now, data masking is essentially where you hide parts of the data so they can't be misused. It's like in those movies where you need a certain key to unlock a tomb or something, but the key has two parts. So when you mask it, you're hiding part of that data so that all of it can't be put together. It's a very common example is when you're inputting your credit card information, right? Well, then it only shows the last four digits of your card number. That's an example of data masking, where it covers the majority of the information, but only gives you a little bit. Typically, data masking is used for identification purposes. What I mean by identification is if you're trying to pick a credit card to use when you're about to purchase something, typically that credit card, you'll be able to identify the credit card based on the last four numbers. That's what data masking means. And the last one is legal compliance. So legal compliance is making sure that you're adhering to very specific laws that pertain to you and your business. Specifically, we're talking about data privacy here. Now, with data privacy, two big ones come to mind that you should be aware of. The first one is GDPR. It stands for General Data Protection Regulation. This rolled out in between 2016 and 2018. A lot of companies have to comply with this. With GDPR, if you are an EU citizen, well then if you have like .eu in your email, well then you would fit in this, okay? Because it's in regard to the European Union. So if you don't know what this is, highly suggest you look it up. And the next one is CCPA, that stands for California Consumer Protection Act. As a California resident, I fall under this. If I'm a California resident and someone is misusing my data, I can report them to CCPA and then they can go ahead and uh, address them. We have a question here from Mr. Abraha. So the question is, how secure is data masking? Now, you have to understand, data masking, it's not really, it is meant to kind of like protect the data. However, its main purpose is essentially to not expose information needlessly. A very simple example is when you're trying to, if you're on Amazon or your favorite shopping app, you already have your credit card information saved. Well, when you go to click on your credit card typically it'll only show you those 4 digits. The reason why is you don't need to know the full number. If you can identify a credit card by just the 4 digits, well, then that's what they'll show on the screen. One of the reasons why is because some people could be watching your screen. And so protecting that information is one of the ways that it's another layer of protection. Same reason why sometimes when you type in your password, you can't see the actual letters. It only shows up as one of those black circles. That is a form of data masking. So data masking is a layer of security. If anything, it does have a psychological effect on the user, letting them know that, hey, we are protecting your data. All right. Now, before we go into these sections, I want to mention something. So when it comes to the concept of data protection, we have to wonder, okay, who is actually in charge of it? Who's actually in charge of data protection? Well, the example is everyone at the company. Remember that. If anyone asks who is responsible for cybersecurity, who's responsible for data protection, you say everyone. The reason why is because everyone is working with data at some time or another. So it's everyone's responsibility to act ethically on how they use and transmit that data. Okay, we'll talk about the different data types later on. Another thing that we have to talk about is who sets up the protection. Now, the setting up of the technical protection does fall under the IT and the security team. However, the end users are responsible to using and managing the data properly. Lastly, tied to the concept of who's responsible, it's employees have to have a general guideline of how to handle data. Typically, you'll have a document called your information security policy. That information security policy also includes information on how data should be used, specifically high risk or sensitive data. High risk data is essentially data that, if obtained by a threat actor, could be very damaging to you and the organization. Typically, those types of data are the ones that are prioritized when you're trying to protect it. So keep in mind that data protection is everyone's responsibility. So why does it matter? Well, pretty self-explanatorily, one of the reasons why it matters is obviously because of data breaches. So if you have data protection in place, well, then you protect against the data breach, which means you protect against all of these reasons. If you want to be compliant, if you want to make sure that your business is able to continue, business continuity, well, then you need to have these data protections in place to make sure that you avoid things such as fines, you avoid things such as losing money because your business is down. You are adhering to the best confidentiality practices and the best privacy practices. So data protection, make sure to set the expectation with you and your team internally, as well as your external stakeholders of the fact that you are a trustworthy entity. Okay. Now, we'll talk a little bit about different types of data, such as intellectual property, so you don't have to worry too much about that. And then the next one is protecting against identity theft and financial fraud. So, as you can imagine, personal data and financial data are two of the biggest targets for threat actors. The reason why is because if they get your personal data and your financial data, they can essentially reach out to any organization that exists and say, "Hey, I'm this person. I want to transfer this amount here." With AI, this is actually booming, where a lot of threat actors are using AI to mimic people's voices, using AI to try to recreate their face, even though AI does have some good placeholders in the sense that they say, hey, we can't recreate or make someone do something based off of a picture. Excuse me. All right. Now, something to understand about data. When when we're talking about data, yes, we're talking about data as a company. However, you should understand that right now in this day and age in 2025, there is so much data that floods the internet and floods all of these companies. When I'm saying there are terabytes on terabytes of data daily, well, then believe you me that it gets more and more complicated to handle and manage. Oh, thank you for mentioning that, Brendan. Yeah, The Accountant 2 is free on Amazon Prime. If you have Amazon Prime, I encourage you to watch it. There's a very cool scene in that movie that shows, I would say, it's a dramatized and it's a far more, how should I say? It's far more cinematic than actual hacking, but there's a pretty cool hacking scene in there that I think you should check out. All right. Let's carry on then. So we already talked about it's important because we want to avoid fines, we want to avoid legal trouble, and you want to maintain your reputation and trust. So let's talk about actual data backups. So what is a backup? A backup is simply a copy of the data that you already have. So it's stored in a separate location. Maybe it's stored right next to each other. That's why they show you this data center here. So this is a very common looking data center. If anything, there aren't very many. So let's see. Data center. So there are a lot of different data centers that exist. Um, so this is example of one. They're typically these rooms that are uh, temperature controlled. There are a bunch of wires connecting them. These are all data centers, and this is the data that you're trying to protect. Is a data center and server room the same thing? Yeah, essentially. Sometimes your server room, because here you see in this picture, so it has racks, right? These racks can be server racks where it's a web server, maybe it's a data server or what have you. But the concept is that if there is a server or a device that stores data on there, it could be considered like a data center. So, like I said, when it comes to backups, we want to make sure to copy and store information separately. Remember when we talked about air-gapped before? So air-gapped data backups are essentially like putting all of your information or your backup on a hard drive that is not connected to the internet. So, how does a backup work? Well, typically, let's say you're working at a company and it's Monday. On Monday, you do work that day and then you leave, and then you come back on Tuesday. Well, then on Monday, all of your data and all the work that you've done has been copied or duplicated into another location. Now, it can be an interval. So sometimes companies will duplicate your information on a daily basis. Sometimes they'll duplicate it on a hourly basis. Sometimes they'll only duplicate it if there have been changes made to the actual data. Why do some companies do that? To save money. Because then you're only backing things up that have changed. You don't do full backups every time. It saves you on costs. It saves you uh, on a lot of on a lot of space as well. There's and that's what regular data copies are. It's just copying your data time and time again to make sure you don't lose anything. And then there's storage redundancy. So storage is where you're storing your data. It can be like that external hard drive. It's when you back up that storage in a specific location, but you have a backup for the backup. Redundancy just means you have backups on backups on backups. Okay. So that's all redundancy means, is having backups. The next one is incremental or full backups. This is something you need to memorize because this is important. When it comes to incremental and full backups, the first concept is a full backup. That's what I explained before. That means that it makes a copy of everything, absolutely everything each time. So at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if you changed one piece of information. It doesn't matter if you changed no piece of information. Okay. It just does a full copy of everything. Incremental backups action in differently is when it only copies what changes were made since the last backup. So it only copies what changes were made since the last backup. And then there's also another one here that I don't think is listed, but it's differential backup. So differential backup, it's copies of any changes since the last full backup. So if you do a full backup, well then if you do any changes, you can have a differential backup that shows that has copies of that since backup. Okay? Would it be better to store your backups on external hard drives if a fire was to occur on one of those data centers? Do data centers have other backup centers in case this one was to happen? That's a very good question, Peter. And I would say the answer to your first question, is it better to store it on external hard drives? It depends on who you talk to and what your data is, because the sensitivity of your data might not allow you to do that. Okay. Now, as a company, you should have a backup on premises. You should also have a backup on cloud, and that cloud should have its own backup. This is a concept of redundancy. Do data centers have backups of other backup centers? Yes, data centers have backups of data centers that have backups on data centers. What's the difference between incremental backup and differential backup? Good question. So incremental backup, so here, incremental backup, it makes copies of data only when there's been a change since the last backup. So if you work on a document on Monday, right, it gets backed up. Tuesday, you don't touch the document, it does not get backed up. Wednesday, you don't touch the document, it does not get backed up. But then on Thursday, you make another change. Well, on Thursday, it then will back it up. Essentially, it'll back up any data if you make changes to it from the last from the last backup. Differential, on the other hand, it copies all of the changes that are made since the last backup. The major difference is incremental only copies the changes that are made, only copies the changes. Differential means it copies all of the changes. Okay, so any change whatsoever, not just the new ones. In what way full backup provides flexibility when you already have all of it with the changes made in incremental? Um, I think I understand what you're saying. So you're asking, how can full backup provide flexibility if you already have it based on incremental? Yeah, that's a very good point. Now, full backups means that you don't have to track changes. You just do backups every day. So there's a flexibility in that, and there's an ease of use in that. That being said, that being said, there are a lot of companies who approach this from a hybrid standpoint, depending on what data they store. I prefer physical online servers are always potentially at risk. Huh, yeah. All right, let's continue on. So, what are some key examples of what are some like life examples of this? Well, for one, there's cloud backup services. So these are things like AWS, Google Cloud, Microsoft Azure. They have easily accessible storage where you can save stuff. And then there's on-site and off-site backups. If you remember, this is a concept of cloud versus on-premises. So you can create backups on a physical device or an external hard drive, and then you can store them in an offshore, offsite location for disaster recovery. This can be as simple as having an external hard drive, saving everything on your computer on that external hard drive, taking it home, and then if something were to happen and the work computers were to crash, you could use that backup. All right. So what are some key considerations? Obviously, frequency and retention. Keep in mind, we have to keep money in mind here. With money, we have to say, okay, how often are we going to back this up? Should it be done every day? Should it be done on a hourly basis? What have you? And then there's a concept of testing the backups, because if you're doing all of these backups and an incident happens, but one of those backups is not functioning as it should, that's a problem. So you need to regularly test the backups to make sure that you can revert to them if needed. And then you have to make sure that you're aligning with all of the compliance requirements. We'll skip the quiz question for now. All right. What are the different data types? Well, I can tell you right now that when it comes to the different data types, they're kind of broken down into a lot more than just these six categories, but for simplicity's sake, there is regulated data. So regulated data is data typically associated with you as a person or financial information. That's why PII, which stands for personally identifiable information, is one of those. It's considered regulated because it's regulated by HIPAA. So, or sorry, it's regulated by a bunch of different agencies such as GDPR, CCPA. They say if there's any personally identifiable information that is being stored, well, then you need to make sure that you're protecting it accordingly. Now, when I say regulated, I mean that it's being regulated not just by law, but also by standardization. Okay. Anytime you are mishandling data, maybe one of the rules is you can't really download all that data onto a USB. It requires special approval to do that. So that is what personally identifiable information is. There's also personal health information, PHI. Now, PHI is protected by HIPAA. If you're unaware, HIPAA stands for Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. It is essentially a regulation that protects patient information to the highest degree. So health information is also an example of regulated data. Then there's financial information. That should be pretty straightforward. It just means any type of information such as credit card numbers, such as a bank account information, as well as transaction history, because that's the gold mine. The gold mine right now is people's data, people's financial information, and people's behavior. If you can monetize people's behavior or essentially find out where they go, what they do, that'll help you a lot as a threat actor. Obviously, another one is trade secrets. So if you're a company like Coca-Cola or KFC, you have a very secret formula that no one knows about and you want to keep that edge, well, then you need to make sure to protect that data. Intellectual property. So this is a big one. If you're a big movie buff, you probably heard, oh, they lost that IP. That stands for intellectual property. Essentially, it just means it's legally protected creative or technical work, right? So examples of IPs are, let's say, patents, copyrights, trademarks, movies. Movies typically have a specific IP and they won't allow other studios to take from it. Then there's also legal information. So legal information is essentially anything in correlation to your communication, your documents, anything that you've spoken with your client or with your attorney, because this information is confidential and should not be shared, which is why legal information has a section of its own. And then we have financial information. So this includes data that is obviously bank statements, username, or sorry, bank statements, credit card information, that kind of stuff. And then we have human and human non-readable. That's like having a PDF file that is unencrypted or a document or a spreadsheet versus nothing, right? Then you have non-readable human data. So this is something that is in relation to very specific code if you can't read code and whatnot. So when you're trying to protect this data, what kind of things do you have to think about? Well, you need to think about, well, what compliance standards do I have to adhere to? Do I have Californian contacts that I need to adhere to CCPA? Do I have European contacts that in my database that I need to be aware of? So you need to understand how the regulated data plays a part in your information, in the data that you store. Then you have to make sure that you have the right access controls to protect against confidentiality. You need to make sure that you have all of the right risk management profiles for intellectual property, same with legal, financial, human, and non-human. All right, let's carry on here. Okay. Data classification. So data classification is a very simple process. It's just kind of creating different categories based on the asset and then putting a value on it. What do I mean by putting a value on it? It means finding out if the information is sensitive information or confidential information. There's a difference between the two. The first one is sensitive. So the concept of sensitive information is that whatever that data is, it could cause harm to someone. It could cause harm to an organization. So sensitive information is essentially like personal information, health records, financial details like your bank statements and whatnot. These are all sensitive information. Now, how do you protect that? You essentially protect it by using strong encryption methods, which will break down encryption in the second half of class, making sure to align with access control, as well as making sure that you adhere to some of the best practices provided by GDPR and HIPAA, because they did care a lot about that. Now, confidential data, on the other hand, is information that is not public. Instead, it's information that is protected. That means that there are privacy laws or intellectual property rights that don't allow that data to go out willy-nilly. Okay. Think it's like trade secrets or business strategies and proprietary research. So what are the kind of protections that you need? Well, you need to make sure that if you're trying to protect your confidential data, well, then you need to make sure that your employees sign an NDA, that stands for a non-disclosure agreement, to make sure that when they access the information, they're also asking you not to use it nefariously. And then there's public data. So in very short terms, public data is anything that is accessible on the internet, such as a website, such as a Facebook ad, such as public social media accounts is also an example of data classification. Restricted data, restricted data is just critical data that have like strict controls. That's all it is. Critical data that has strict controls. And you can only access it if you're a certain individual. Now, as you can imagine, because it's restricted data, that means that it's associated with the AAA concept, authentication, authorization, and accounting. So government falls into this, any government data. And then we have private data. So this is your personal information. This is why data protection exists and privacy exists, is to protect your personal information. And the last one is critical data. Now, critical data in its very simple terms is data that is essential for operations or essential for the survivor of the company. So that's all critical data is. Obviously, it has a lot of security controls listed and associated with it. How do you implement data classification? As you can remember, I talked about how in cybersecurity, you need to know your data and you need to know your infrastructure in order to protect it. That's why we do what we call a data inventory. We essentially look through all of the data that we have, all of our networks, where information is going, and you draft it in a data inventory so that if an auditor asks you, hey, what is the process flow of you sending an email to your contractor? Well, then you say, well, I draft the email, it goes to our it goes to our data center with our two firewalls, and then it carries on to this and that, and it kind of like snowballs, right? So it's taking an inventory. Then making sure to have a classification policy. That means that you have a policy that clearly lists out what kind of data it is, whether it's private data, whether it's public data, whether if it's a confidential data. Having these spelled out very specifically is really important, because then people can say, oh, I didn't know that was sensitive. You just send them that document and say, these are the definitions. That's literally something I've had to do in the past. Next, we have data tagging. So data tagging is essentially it's to make sure that the right security controls can automatically be applied based on whatever category it's on. Now, back to the point of classification policy, that is something that gets socialized or shared to other resources, which is why there's something called training and awareness. Training and awareness is essentially just making sure that the employees understand the importance of data classification and understand what their role is in protecting it. Now, as you remember, the role of cybersecurity is not meant for one person or one department. Everyone is responsible for it. And then regular reviews. So regular reviews is just telling your team, hey, let's do a quick review of all of our data flows and patch anything that we see as gaps. Or the reviews can also be done by auditors, which we'll talk about a little later. So we talked about data classification, right? Well, then we have to also understand the different types of states that data is in. There are three big ones. Now, these are definitely things that you need to remember because someone is going to ask you someday, hey, what are the different data states that it lives in? Well, it depends because a data state is essentially dependent on what the data is and what it's used for. So whether it's been just stored for storage sake, whether it's being moved for whatever, or where it's being used. Each of these ways of interacting with data have a reason. And so we have to make sure to dissect and understand all of them. The first one is called data at rest. In very simple terms, it's data that's not being used. It just exists. So an example of this would be a hard drive. If I have a hard drive, I'm not actively using it. It's not actively being used. Instead, it's disconnected from my computer and it just exists. That's data at rest. So how do you protect data at rest? Well, in very simple terms, you make sure to encrypt it and make sure that you're the only one who can decrypt it. You can make sure that you don't have it with you. So there's like a physical location boundary from you to be able to access that information. And the last one is access control. That means making sure that you have multiple layers of security on whatever device or whatever you're trying to work on. After data at rest, we have something called data in transit. Data in transit is when you're sending information across the internet. So it's like if you were moving across the internet from user to user, website to website, or system to system. And if you're doing that, transit, you're trans you're transporting your data accordingly. So, as you can imagine, this is why VPNs exist, is to protect this kind of thing. On top of that, a lot of people have come out and said that they use a lot of encryption, they use a lot of VPNs, they also use a lot of security emails to communicate with the different resources. Now that's data in transit. That's pretty explanatory. And the last one is data in use. The way that I like to explain data in use is if someone is creating the data or adjusting the data actively. A very simple example is if you're filling out something in Excel, you're essentially creating data that is being data in use. Which data state gets hacked more? Rest, transit, or in use? That's a very good question. So it depends on who you talk to. So let's actually do this. Let's go ahead and use one of my favorite tools, which is called Perplexity, and say, which one gets used more? Now, if I haven't shown you Perplexity before, it's a really cool tool. It's like Google on steroids. It essentially looks for a bunch of data that's available on the internet. Okay. So, as compared, the answer depends on the risk profile. Da, da, da. So, data at rest is generally hacked more than the numbers. Now, I've seen both. I've seen data at rest be something that's been targeted because it's the one of the easiest ones to go after. Then I've also seen data in transit, but this tends to be a bit more technical. Data at rest is easier to go for and easier to attack because it's more vulnerable and then people don't put as much protection on them. So that's why people tend to go for that. Good question. All right, let's carry on. So with the data, the different states, we have data at rest, data in transit, and data in yeah, data at rest, data in transit, and data in use. All right, so what are some other considerations that you need to keep in mind when it comes to data? Well, some of the things that we like to think about is um, data sovereignty. So data sovereignty is essentially the easiest way to think of it is here, that digital data is subject to laws and governance structures of the company on where it's stored. This is important because just like how you have sovereignty um, as it's important because even if you have sovereignty as a citizen of a country, well, the same thing goes for the data because the data has sovereignty based on where it's stored. A simple example is something like regulatory compliance. If you have any California resident information, well, then you need to comply with GDPR. If you have any European contact information, you need to comply with GDPR. There are other states such as Colorado, Vermont, Utah. There are some other states that are starting to follow in the footprints of CCPA. So you need to, sometimes a lot of these governments are going to say, hey, you need to also make sure that you're following our laws and our best practices on data. So you need to make sure to protect that data as best you can and make sure that access control is set in place properly. And then there's cross-border data transfer. So cross-border data transfer is essentially making sure that the information is transferred securely across country lines. Speaking of country lines, geolocation. Now, geolocation in this case is the physical location of where data is sent or where it's being processed or used. Now, this is sometimes controlled by the laws and regulations of said country. However, it does apply to data as well. So, what are some implications? Well, if you're trying to transfer something from Australia all the way to, let's say, like Paris, that's going to be a really long piece of data. So, it's going to cause a level of latency or performance issues. Then there's disaster recovery and data redundancy. If you're doing geolocation, well then you have to also make sure to plan it accordingly depending on time zones, and that can be a little difficult. All right, let's see. Yeah, I think that touches on all of that. We already discussed all of this. All right, the last one that we'll talk about before we go on break is regulatory compliance. So, regulatory compliance, like I said before, is following laws or industry rules, guidelines, best practices, and see how that applies to your business. Every business is different, and so they probably don't have to deal with all of the same things. For example, a mom and pop shop, they're just run internally. They're going to be very different from, let's say, an accounting firm. An accounting firm is going to have to pay a lot of attention to all of their IT controls because they're storing people's information. A mom and pop pizza shop, they're mainly just taking money and then selling them a pizza. Most of these places, they'll have cloud storage. They won't go to the effort of storing all the payment information in one location. Or, sorry, all of the payment information on site because then it takes a lot of time and effort. Instead, they'll store that information in public backups, such as the cloud or GCP. So, what are the common types of compliance standards? Well, there's data protection laws. This became very important in the past couple of years. So GDPR is one of them, General Data Protection Regulation, CCPA, which is California Consumer and Privacy. And then there's HIPAA, HIPAA is in relation to the health industry. It's making sure that the information that you have on you as a patient stays hidden and stays secret. Then, if you're trying to adhere to certain industry standards, ISO 27001 is a common one. The NIST cybersecurity framework is also a common one. Now, keep in mind that this is a framework. This is an actual compliance or a certification. Instead, you're saying, hey, we follow NIST cybersecurity frameworks. And the last one is PCI DSS. That stands for Payment Card Industry and Data Security Standard. So this, in essence, is essentially trying to protect payment information. That's what it's trying to do. Um, when it comes to regulatory compliance, there are going to be instances where the auditor is going to ask you, hey, when was the last time you did XYZ? Well, then you need to make sure that you have reports showing when you did a certain action. This is very common in the auditing world. And then periodic assessments. There are some industries out there that say you need to do an assessment of your team on a quarterly basis. The assessment is essentially assessing all the security controls, making sure that everything functions correctly, and then you want to make sure that you meet the compliance standards that were set before you beforehand, as well as mitigate the risks. All right, some of the common things you've seen are GDPR and HIPAA. I'll let you read that. And then I think I already explained all this. All right, here we go. And see, it's good. So in short, we talked about other classifications of data, data sovereignty, geolocation, and the different challenges associated with it. Now let's talk about compliance. Now, when it comes to compliance, I know I had mentioned several different types of compliance standards and what exactly they mean. To kind of reiterate again what exactly we mean when we say compliance, it's essentially the term that I like to use in order to define it is um, just following the law or following like regulations or industry rules, as I guess you could say. As you can imagine, being in the cybersecurity industry, there are a lot of guidelines, rules, and regulations that we have to follow, and they differ depending on what kind of data or services an organization is trying to use. So these regulations, these guidelines, and these standards involve a lot of things. So they involve security controls, best practices. They revolve around monitoring, good documentation, record keeping, as well as data privacy. Something that's not talked about often is the reporting that is required. So at times you need to do a specific report on a specific cadence. Example, one of the things that SOX, the Sarbanes-Oxley compliance standard requires is for people to do a user access review. It is part of access control. User access review, otherwise known as UAR, is essentially where your team or your managers are in charge of looking at all your systems and finding out who has access to what and determining if they still need access or if they can revoke that access. This is following the principle of least privilege. If someone changed roles or if someone became a manager, do they still need to have access to this rudimentary level service that may not be as needed or necessary? So you as an organization have to do that quarterly if you want to be SOX compliant. So how does it work? Well, essentially, there are data protection laws that you have to adhere to. One of the ones I mentioned is GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation. This is for the EU. CCPA, which is California Consumer Protection Privacy Act, and then HIPAA, which stands for Health Insurance Portability and Accessibility Act. So GDPR and CCPA, I dare say they're very similar. They do the same thing. They protect you, the end user, if you use in the EU, if you live in the EU, or if you live in California. HIPAA is a way to protect your information as a patient, right? It regulates essentially like healthcare and patient data, meaning that you have to process it a certain way, it has to be encrypted a certain way because it is very much needed. And then there are security standards. Now, these are protection laws, right? These are things that are actual laws mandated by the government. Then there are security standards. These security standards are essentially like frameworks or regulations that are not necessarily mandated by the government. However, they're industry best practices. That's we have ISO 27001 and the NIST framework. If you're not familiar with the NIST framework, I highly encourage you to at least get to know that because the NIST framework is something that's going to be referenced a lot throughout your cybersecurity career. All right. And then there is the PCI DSS. So this isn't talked about as much, but it is essentially protecting your credit card information. So if you're using your credit card for any purchases, or if it's being stored by a company, they have to adhere to PCI DSS, or at least they should, in order to let you, the customer, know that they are compliant. Record keeping and reporting, just keeping good documentation and reporting to your stakeholders. Periodic assessments, that just means running through specific assessments to assess the security controls. And I think we're good here. We will talk a bit more about assessments later, and I already explained both of these. So some of the key elements to remember in making sure that you are compliant is you have to understand what laws apply to you. For example, if you're in the United States, but your data center is storing information from the EU, you still have to be GDPR compliant, even if it's just one. So that's an example of knowing what laws and regulations apply to you. This is why they have a GRC, Governance, Risk, and Compliance team. They are specialists that understand these regulations and standards and tell you, the organization, how to protect it. Then you have to implement all the security controls and do regular audits. All of these things in when it comes to you as an organization and why you want to be compliant is because you want to avoid fines, you want to avoid any legal repercussions, you want to make sure to protect your customer data, and you want to make sure to avoid reputational damage as well as losing customer trust. These are all important elements. And the way you do that, a lot of these regulatory compliance standards, they focus on things we talked about before. They focus on access control, encryption, they focus on company employee training, and then they focus on clarifying protected data. So something that some of these compliance standards require, something else that's not listed here is called CMMC. So CMMC is a common standardization. It stands for the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. So essentially, you have about 109 different controls, and these are controls that are given by the Department of Justice in the United States. So it was designed by them, and essentially, they have all different levels of security controls. And when you become CMMC certified, you're essentially saying, hey, we follow the same level of scrupulous security controls and standards as the Department of Defense in the United States. That means that we're pretty compliant. The CMMC has very specific recommendations when it comes to access control specifically. And they also have something called data classification. You remember when we talked about data classification before, it's essentially saying, hey, is this sensitive information? Is this critical information and whatnot? But I think we'll touch on that later. All right. Now let's talk about the human factor of cybersecurity. As you can imagine, the human factor is in reference to your employees. It's in reference to their behavior, their actions, how they're using your data. Essentially, what choices they're making. Because as humans, humans are fallible and they are the biggest risk to you as a company. So you want to make sure you understand why they make the choices that they do. Something to remember here. It is not just malicious in intent. Um,
Okay, looks like we lost Andre for a few seconds, so let's give him a
oh,
few minutes to go back.
did you all lose me?
Yes. Are you good?
I think so. For those of you on camera, can you give me a thumbs up if you can see me and hear me okay? Awesome. Thank you, Dan, Omid, Zainab, Paul, way back. Appreciate you all. Okay, sorry about that. I don't know why it kicked me out. So the last thing I mentioned was when it comes to the human factor, sometimes things can be done on accident. They reply to an email on accident, or they don't they may like on accidentally take some data home. Okay. So why is it important for us to take this in consideration? Well, in essence, we want to make sure that we know what the employees are doing. We understand the reasons behind their decisions, and we're able to respond in case something happens. Okay. So, how exactly does this work? Well, believe it or not, this is one of the big reasons why I got into cybersecurity. It is the people and understanding why they do what they do. This is where behavioral psychology comes into play. This is where having a good company culture comes into play. You want to understand human patterns and motivations and behaviors and biases that may lead to any security gaps, right? So understanding them, such as if they fail phishing emails and how often they fail, is important, and making sure that if they fail often enough, there is a class or something that they can take in order to learn how to do better. The reason for that is because you want to train your employees to be more security conscious. It's not just, hey, you have to watch the security awareness video. You're actively protecting the company when your employees are trained. That's why security awareness and training is one of the most vital parts in cybersecurity, because you're addressing the source of what is around 80% of all breaches. So you want to make sure that you have a user-centric security design, meaning that your security policies and your culture, your procedures, they are all focused on security, but they keep the user in mind. And then we already talked about culture in the past, where you want to make sure that there's a culture of security where it fosters responsibility among employees. If you ever join an organization, um, you should ask them this question. If you ask your employees who's responsible for cybersecurity, do they typically say you, the IT and security team, or do they say everyone? Because the answer should be everyone. So we already talked about both of these, so we're good. Some key considerations when it comes to human factor. If you're going to remember any metric, remember this one. Around 80% of cybersecurity incidences happen because of humans. That's why phishing is such a useful cybersecurity tool, or a threat actor tool, because it exploits the emotions and the behavioral psychology of humans. So you need to do continuous education to stay up with the times. Here's something that you're going to have to come to terms with. So if in case you haven't been paying attention to the internet, Google has come out with Google VO3. And Google VO3 is an AI generation tool that can literally make 8-second AI um, audio, video like clips. And it's indistinguishable. An example is you can look up um, Yeti AI YouTube. So the Yeti AI YouTube is this person right here, or it's Bigfoot, and it's pretending like they're doing a vlog. It is very realistic in nature. If you haven't seen it, I just want to show you a quick clip. S- So that's, and you all can watch this on your own. I won't take class time to show it, but um, you can take a look because it's becoming very realistic and it's becoming to a point where it's almost quote unquote indistinguishable. Now, there's still some telltale signs like hands, mouth movement. I will tell you right now that professionals in our field are saying that the mouth movement and expression is one of the ways you can tell if a video is fake or not. This is important because this is only going to get better. There's going to come a point in time where it's going to be very difficult to tell between the two. If something looks too nice, if the skin's too nice, well, then you'll know that it's probably AI. So continuous education is important. User-centric security policies, making sure that you're crafting policies that have human interaction in mind, that they're realistic, achievable, that doesn't cause too much friction, and then encouraging a reporting culture. So what does that mean? Encouraging a reporting culture means making sure that your work environment is one where employees feel safe to report a security incident. Sometimes employees are too scared to report those incidences because they're like, well, maybe I'll get in trouble. You want to make sure you say, hey, we care more about protecting you and protecting our data than we care about like the cause. We'll talk about the cause later on and we'll figure it out, but it's going to be like a collaborative effort. It's not going to be a finger pointing effort. Okay. So you want to make sure to create that environment of security. Okay, security audits and assessments. I'm going to breeze through this one real quick, okay? So an audit is when you bring in an external resource or an external entity and they audit your security infrastructure. That means that they meet with the different teams and they ask the teams, hey, can you provide us a document of your security architecture? Can you provide us a document that proves that you're doing user access reviews every quarter? Sometimes they'll say, can you give us the document proving that you did user training several times a year, right? These are all examples of evidence that auditors are going to request. Now, an auditor, there are a bunch of auditors out there. So Accenture does auditing, Deloitte does auditing, KPMG, PwC. These are some of the biggest security auditors that exist out there, including EY. They also do cybersecurity auditing. So if you're interested in auditing, that might be an area where you can where you can consider. Now, how the security and audits and assessments work. Well, sorry, I mentioned audits. Assessments is assessment in other terms, it's more flexible. Typically, an assessment can be done internally. An audit is typically when you have an external resource to it. Could you do it internally? Yeah, you could. They have something called an internal auditing team that serves as like the audit before the actual audit, but typically it's an external resource. An assessment is essentially an internal. review that you can do, and it is essentially looking at how effective your security controls are. It's looking at the security controls are functioning as it should. Are there any gaps? And its main goal is to make improvements. An audit is a pass or fail. That's the goal, is to pass it. An assessment is where are the gaps? How can we improve? It's very simple. So the way that audits and assessments work is they look for the risks, they try to identify them, and then they verify if you're, especially if you're in audit, sometimes you will specifically do a compliance specific audit. So it could be a GDPR audit, it could be ISO audit, it could be PCI DSS audit. They essentially select the one that they're going to audit, and then you work really, really hard for several months to collect all the evidence and make sure you're as prepared as possible. And then there's the evaluation of controls. Now, anytime you're doing an audit or assessment, you'll have certain controls that you have to adhere to. Those controls are what you're being measured against. So it's important for you as a cybersecurity professional to know what those controls are so that you meet that certain score. Remember when I mentioned CMMC before? CMMC, made by the DoD, they have five levels for each control. So 0 to 4. 0 counts as a level, by the way, because 0 means that you don't have that control in place. And then 1, 2, 3, 4 says you have certain level of maturity. Why we do that is because anytime you are doing like an audit, well, then you get a score specifically for CMMC. Because with CMMC, they take all of the controls based on their score, 0 to 4, and then based off that information, you get a final CMMC score. That score is going to dictate whether you are very mature or not mature at all. All right, so then you might be wondering, okay, well, how often should I be doing these assessments? Well, these assessments should be done, I would say, fairly often. They should be done more often than not. It should not be an annual thing. I think it should at least be a quarterly thing. This is why these GRC team exists. Their entire goal is to make sure that assessments are being done and that you are approaching it with intention and the goal to pass, the goal to have your security controls actually be effective. Documentation is a really big part of security audits and assessment because this is where the auditors are going to ask you, hey, do you have XYZ and can we see it? Here's the thing. If you're an auditor, you don't have to say, hey, can you just provide me the documentation for this past year? Instead, you can say, I would like documentation of when you did your last access control review from February of 2025. That's how specific they can be. So you need to have all of that documentation prepared and ready to give to the auditor so that they can assess it. I've worked on some audits where an auditor did not let something pass because they didn't, when they provide a screenshot, the screenshot didn't show the date and time on the upper right-hand corner to validate when that screenshot was taken, which is valid. Every single piece of documentation you provide to auditing should have like the time and date so that you can validate when it was taken. And then continuous improvement, that's what the assessments are. It's just redoing the assessments, finding out where the gaps are, improving it. Typically, you want to have a benchmark that said last year we hit this score or we passed this way. This year we want to have a higher score or whatnot. So let's breeze through a couple more things here. The first one is data confidentiality. This ties into the CIA triad. Essentially, confidentiality is regards to making sure that only the right people can access certain things, certain assets. So this is where the authorization comes in. Are you authorized to access this one thing? So how exactly do we do that? Well, like we had mentioned before, it's essentially the use of access control, making sure that we have an authentication mechanism in place, making sure that we have RBAC. RBAC stands for role-based access control, and then making sure that the users have the right permissions to access it. Then we also have encryption. We are protecting the data at rest and in transit so that outsiders can't read it. Confidentiality isn't just about access control, it's also making sure that when your data is being sent across the internet, that it's being sent securely, that no one can just look at it. And then there's anonymization, data masking. We had already talked about that, as well as physical security controls. So that means that typically all of those servers that I showed you in the past, they all have physical security controls in them, meaning that you need to badge in, you need to put in a code, there's biometric. Only certain people have access to those server rooms because they're so integral, right? Obviously, there are also cameras and security guards where applicable. So, important things to consider. Well, there's the concept of identifying and categorizing data based on its sensitivity. Then you also want to do employee training to understand, hey, confidentiality is important, and this is why, followed by data handling policies. Now, data handling policies, this can be an actual document. It's an actual document that exists in your security and compliance repository where you give to new employees or you give to all the employees saying, hey, just so you all know, at our company, this is how we are supposed to handle data. In that section, there'll typically be something that says how to handle high risk data or how to handle high sensitivity data. These are all important things to know because if, let's say, you're a project manager and you need to send a big piece of file to a customer, the data handling policy is going to dictate how you send it. Now, you could just email it, but there's a level of risk involved with that. For example, what if the customer's computer gets stolen or hacked, right? Something like that. In this case, you would typically want to use a secure file transfer method such as an SFTP. SFTP stands for Secure File Transfer Protocol. It's essentially where you can send a file through a secure system that allows the end user with the same username and password or same credentials to be able to access it. So that's what data handling policies means. So on top of data confidentiality, we also have data integrity. Data integrity, like you already know, means that the information that exists in your systems, the files that you have, remain accurate. They haven't been changed. They haven't been altered in any way, and you can trust that they haven't been altered. So, why is this important? Well, for one thing, if someone tampers with data, such as if someone tampers with code, someone tampers with website code, maybe someone tampers with banking information to route number a different way, it could really lead to a lot of downfall on the business's end. Okay. So you want to make sure to protect that. Well, how do we do that? There is something called a checksum. So a checksum and hashing, in very simple terms, is essentially when you put a digital fingerprint on that piece of data. When you put a digital fingerprint on that piece of data, well, then it can be detected even if a small change was made to the data or the file. Okay. Any changes will be figured out. So think of a checksum as like, hey, does this have the blue fingerprint? It does. Great. Oh, this fingerprint is no longer blue. It's now black. Well, that's not good. So you want to double check that. And then there's error-based detection and correction. So this is essentially a sophisticated method where you can find any errors or inconsistencies in the data storage. This is typically done in a scan of some sort. Access control and permissions. This was already listed before. Something that's also not listed here is you can also check the logs of anytime something has been accessed or anything has been changed. Then there's also version control. So version control, it essentially tracks any data changes over time and prevents accidental overwrites. So if someone accidentally overwrites something, well, then you can essentially revert back to it. An example is Google Docs. Google Docs has a version control feature where if you can go and see the version of your document and then revert to that accordingly. I think we talked about all of these already, so I think we'll go ahead and move on here. Next is data availability. Now, data availability, in very simple terms, is making sure that authorized users are the ones who can access the data when they need it, aka is our platform usable? Is our platform readily available to the people that need to use it? I think we've talked about this before. If there's a natural disaster like an earthquake or fire, if there's a DDoS attack, that stands for distributed denial of service. The distributed denial of service attack is meant to affect the availability of data. Oh, someone said I'm frozen again. Are we? Let's see. Keith, are you able to hear me okay? Am I good? Okay. Okay. Sorry about that all. Okay. Sorry. All right, let's continue. So the DDoS attack is essentially meant to affect the availability of data. And so that could be a reason why it goes out. Well, what are the ways that we can protect against that? Well, this is where the concept of redundancy comes in. That means having backups on backups on backups. If you remember, we talked about RAID before, RAID. So RAID is essentially a redundancy feature that has different forms of backups. Now, this one is showing you 10 different RAID levels, but you really just need 3 or 4. Depending on how big your organization is. But you can use Perplexity to look this up and give it to you in very easy to understand formats. Then you need to have a backup and recovery system. That means you need to have some form of documented system, of listed system that says, hey, this is the information that we have. This is how we back it up on a ongoing process. TAs and correlation 1, we might want to note that we might be having some Zoom issues. Um, so we can do a retro on that later. If you did lose me, if at all you lose me or at any point, just keep in mind this is being recorded, so you will be able to review this later on, so don't fret too much, okay? Next, you need to have load balancing and scalability. Why is this important? Because this is a first layer of defense to availability. If there's ever a DDoS attack and you have a load balancer, well, then the load balancer can shift all of the traffic evenly or shift it to a location that can handle it a lot better. And then there's disaster recovery planning, DRP. We had talked about this before. DRP stands for disaster recovery planning. It is a very technical profession where you have to plan and have strategies in place to protect in case of a fire or any of these emergencies. So, like I mentioned, the big three, Amazon, Microsoft, and Google. So Amazon is AWS, Microsoft is Microsoft Azure, and then Google Cloud is Google Cloud Platform, GCP. Those are the ones that are used the most by a lot of corporations. And then you need to make sure you have high availability architectures, meaning you have backups on backups, you have redundancy, you have load balancers, you have firewalls at different points. If you remember, I showed you that diagram that showed all the different firewalls. That's a security mechanism to make sure that it captures any attempts. And then some key considerations. When you're using any of these third parties, you have to keep in mind that they are a service. So they need to sign what you call an SLA, a service level agreement. The service level agreement in its totality is meant to define how long you can go without their service. So they say, hey, I put in XYZ, and so it went down, it needs to be up in 1 hour, or it needs to be up in 5 hours, right? It is meant to define the acceptable downtime, and recovery times. This is where we had talked about before when we talked about DRP of RTO and RPO, recovery time objective and recovery point objective. All these two things are measurements of time to say how long do we agree to be down for until it becomes a problem. And then there's conducting regular tests and drills, and then making sure you have the right security measures in place. So let's talk about DLP. DLP stands for data loss prevention. So data loss prevention as a whole is meant to be like a fail-safe per se. So it is meant to protect or to have some infrastructure and policies in place to stop any information from leaking or being stolen. Now, this can be both for intentional as well as accidentally. A DLP is meant to protect data such as PII data, personally identifiable information, names, emails, social security numbers, financial data such as credit card information or company secrets. These are all pieces of data that we're trying to protect from being lost. Another term for this is data exfiltration prevention. So data exfiltration is specifically when there's a threat actor, an internal threat rather. An internal threat will try to exfiltrate data, which is considered data loss as well. So how exactly does it work? Well, what happens is you can do a lot of scanning. If you classify your data appropriately, so like what I had mentioned before, the personal information, financial information, what have you, classifying it will essentially allow you to set the right protections in place. Once you have the set right protections in place, well, then you can do policy enforcement, meaning that both culturally as an organization, as well as technically, you can have your system look for certain information and then take action if if XYZ happens, both on the network and at the endpoint level. Obviously, doing monitoring and detection is still something very important. Now, when we're saying detection, keep in mind, I'm not just saying detecting on the network level. You also want to do endpoint detection, meaning endpoint detection is the end user. You want to stop users from accompanying sensitive information files onto USBs. There is typically something that says if you're using a company computer, you aren't allowed to use USB. You have to make a special request for that. So this is a way that you do DLP, data loss prevention. All right, and some key considerations here. Um, User training is important because when it comes to data loss, it is humanistic in nature. We are trying to prevent data from humans from releasing it, even accidentally. And then we also want to make sure that we're adhering with the right compliance standards, as well as integrating a lot of tech. Integrating a lot of tech means making sure that there are security measures that protect that. A very common one, firewalls. Firewalls have sets of rules within them to say if there is X amount of data that is trying to be exfiltrated at a very fast rate, will then block that traffic or don't allow that traffic to exit the network. So let's do a little quiz question. Quiz question, go ahead. So, what is a common human error that would compromise data confidentiality? A, B, C, or D? A, B, C, or D? We have a lot of answers come in. Everyone is saying C. Well done, everyone. That is correct. So keep in mind that data compromise and data loss can be any sort of asset or any sort of data that keeps things functioning. That includes passwords. This is why social engineering is still one of the most useful and powerful ways to to hack because it's so easy to create and so easy to fall for. All right. Now let's talk about data security implementation. So Data security implementation is we have the plan, we already know what to do. Well, then it's the next step is putting all of these protections or putting all these things into motion, to putting them into action. So we know that we need to protect the data. So then how exactly do we protect it from any change? How do we protect it on the CIA triad? Well, there are a bunch of different ways to do it. So one of the first ones is geographic restrictions. So in very simple terms, it's not allowing devices to access your internal network from different countries. So when I did a government contract and I went to Mexico, I was told I can't bring my laptop because I can't connect to the internal network if I'm in Mexico. And so that's an example of geofencing where you're not allowing access to data based on your location. So this is something in regards to data sovereignty and laws. The example, if you're going to, let's say, a country that is dubious in nature with your home country's infrastructure, well, then you wouldn't be allowed to access your home country's infrastructure, potentially from being forced to do so. Another very common practice, like I mentioned before, is encryption. We'll talk about this very much in depth a little later. I'll explain the different types of encryption. Same thing with hashing, masking, and tokenization, because we'll dive into all of those here in another session. Now, there is a concept called obfuscation. Obfuscation is essentially when you turn your data unclear without altering any of its actual content. It's like taking a letter and then essentially like cutting it into pieces, putting it into a jar, and then kind of shaking it, okay? Because you don't change the actual content, you're just making it all jumbled up. Sure, someone could put it back together if they put in a lot of time, but it's painstaking, right? And the idea here is to add a layer of complexity. We already talked about network segmentation in the past, so I'll skip that. But there's also the concept of permission restrictions. So permission restrictions is essentially an access control tool where you only give access to someone based off of their role. RBAC falls into this, role-based access control, because you're restricting permissions. Permissions are typically you can read, write, or you can read and write, right, to the file. An example is creating a document. So in this case, you set the right permission and say, okay, you can read it, meaning you have view access, but you can't write it and you can't make changes to it. Okay. So that's one of the ways that permission restriction adds a layer of security. Now, with geographic restrictions, right? Um, Limiting what data you can store and process or get access is not just something in relation to like accessing data. It's also where data is being stored, right? So what do I mean by data being stored? We talked about server farms. We talked about a bunch of places where you can store information. Well, all of that data needs to adhere to the laws of that country. So that's why there's data sovereign laws. A lot of countries have this in place to protect the data that is housed within their borders. So if you're an organization, you can use this to your advantage to make sure that because you have to adhere to the government's requirements, there are already strong security controls set in place. So you can abide by that. For example, GDPR may restrict the transferring of personal data outside the EU. So they say, hey, you can't send this data over to Australia or to Southeast Asia or what have you. It's a concept of national security because they want to make sure that you only have access to, you're processing the data with integrity. We're going to skip over these. I think you all can read those on your own. You want to make sure that when you're using geographic restrictions, that you have a dedicated service, a dedicated GPS service or a GPS server that will essentially be able to accurately pinpoint the information for you. The other concept is you have to pay attention to privacy. Now, when you're implementing geofencing or doing things from the uh, the location standpoint, it does require you to make sure that you're processing data and processing users' information. If you're doing that, there might be a privacy concern from the user saying, hey, why are you taking all of my data? Why is this something that you're doing more of? Now, this is where I wanted to spend the bulk of our time. So I mentioned encryption, right? If I were to explain it, if I were to explain it, encryption is just making readable data and scrambling it into code that no one can read. So now the idea is to make it unreadable to humans. If you have the right key, you can decrypt it and make it readable to humans again. That's all it is. You may see all this fancy stuff about encryption, but at its core, it's making something readable if you have the key to unlock it. Okay. Now, there are two types of encryptions. So the first one is symmetric encryption, and the next one is asymmetric encryption. We're going to have an entire slide focused on these two, but in a nutshell, symmetric encryption is symmetric, meaning that there are two, and both of them use the same key to encrypt and decrypt. A very important thing to remember is symmetric encryption is faster. Symmetric encryption is faster. Asymmetric encryption is the opposite, meaning that there is a public key and a private key. The public key does the encryption, the private key does the decrypting. If anything, asymmetric is safer for sharing and it's more secure, but it's not as fast as symmetric. Okay? Now, when it comes to the encryption process, you might be curious, okay, well, where does that happen? Well, it can happen at many levels. It can happen at your file level. So you can protect your files with asymmetric or symmetric encryption. You can protect your data through HTTPS websites. So making sure that if you have HTTPS on your website, well, then it's using that type of encryption, followed by encrypting emails. So typically, if you send emails that aren't encrypted, well, then the other party will have to have a key in order to decrypt it, whether it's symmetric or asymmetric. If you're going to remember anything from this class, memorize this. There's going to be one or two questions on your exam asking about symmetric or asymmetric encryption. Remember, symmetric is faster, same key. Asymmetric, two keys, not as fast, but more secure. What is hashing? So hashing, if you've never heard of it, it converts data into a fixed length and irreversible string. So typically hashing is associated with passwords. It takes like your password. I know no one has this password 123. It takes password 123 and then it makes it into this long string. It hashes it so that it doesn't say password 123. Instead, it has this long string that has no real meaning. And then you can't get the original back just about yet. There's also something called salted hash. Salted hash means that you hash it, but then you add a little salt to it, which means that there are additional characters that are inserted in that hash that make it even more complicated to decrypt. Now, the main reason for using hashing is to securely store your passwords. So you don't store your password in plain text, so a threat actor can just copy and paste it into their location. Instead, you can hash it out. And you can look up salted hash on your own. I think Professor Messer has a really great video on that. And then we have the concept of masking. Like I already explained before, masking is when your credit card information, you just see the last four digits, or your social security, you see the last four digits. Okay. It hides part of the data while showing just enough for you to identify it and for it to be useful. Why is this important? Well, this is important because it just limits the view of anyone looking at this. For example, if you're looking at it and you might be in a public place, well, then it only shows those documents. If a an employee, let's say like at a call center or at a bank, is helping you with something, well, then they don't need to see your full card information. They just say, should we charge it to the one ending in card 572 or something like that, right? Then you say yes. The idea here with masking is you just reduce the amount of visibility. We talked about tokenization as well. So tokenization is the process of replacing sensitive data that you have with a random token. So that has no meaning, okay? Replacing it with a random token for just placeholder sake. The original data is stored separately and mapped securely. So the tokenization process is essentially securing the data while maintaining usability, okay? I'll let you all look that one up a little later. Now, these are all the comparisons. I'll also let you look that up later because that's pretty straightforward. Obfuscation, I had explained that it just scrambles and modifies the code, so it's hard to understand, but it's still able to work. All right. Here is a really, really useful diagram for you. Now, I tried to simplify it a little bit, so here you go. Let's see if this will be helpful. Okay, so when it comes to symmetric and asymmetric encryption, as a reminder, symmetric uses the same key. Asymmetric uses two. And the key element here is that symmetric does tend to be a lot faster, okay? And it's suitable, it can take a lot of volume. The asymmetric encryption is slower because it's more complex. It has a lot more things it has to run through. The idea here is that it's it's meant to be used for data at rest, and then asymmetric is used for digital signatures, encrypting data in transit, and these are the different types. No, you are going to have to memorize this. So I highly suggest that you take this a screenshot of this and just memorize it. Now, what I gave you is an extremely simplified version for your understanding. Okay. If anything, it's just to say, hey, symmetric is one, asymmetric is two, symmetric is faster than asymmetric. And then the use case for symmetric is file encryption. Asymmetric is for web security, digital certificates, like that little icon on the upper left-hand corner that says, hey, this website is secure. So that is asymmetric and symmetric encryption. All right. Let me see. Something I want to mention is even though symmetric is faster, there's a con to it. The con is that the key is shared, meaning that two people have it. That means that you have to share that key with someone. When you share it with someone, that means it could potentially be intercepted, meaning that it can be decrypted as well. So the pros of asymmetric is it's safer, it's more secure, and it doesn't require you to share that key at all. Now, of course, it's slower than symmetric and it's more complex, but it is more secure. So it's up to you as the business to decide which version you want to use more. Now, these are some of the examples of the common algorithms that are used for encryption. You can definitely look those up on your own. All right. Now let's talk a bit more about permission restrictions. So permission restrictions that I mentioned before is just putting controls in place to understand who has access to view, read, write, or read and write, aka modify any of these specific files and locations. Okay. The correct term, I said read, write, and view, right? But the correct terminology is actually split into four. So you can read, you can write, you can execute, and then you can delete. So those are the four main access types and the four ways that you can interact with a piece of data. So when it comes to permission restrictions, we want to make sure that A, the authorized people have access to this file, and B, that they have the right permission, whether it's to read, write, execute, or delete. All right. So how can this be applied? Well, one of those is through RBAC, like I had mentioned before. RBAC stands for Role-Based Access Control, and it's based on what department you're in. Like I mentioned, if you're in sales, you only need sales information. If you're in HR, you only need HR. There's no reason why a marketing person needs to have all of HR's access to everyone's personal information. That is role-based access control. Then there's attribute-based access control. Attribute-based access control is a little different in the sense that it's based on things such as location, time of day. Maybe it also has a high-level view of what city someone's in or the department, because you want to make sure to only allow access on XYZ. And then there's mandatory access control. It's based on if information is confidential or information is, let's say, like top secret, well, then you want to include mandatory access control, which is typically done by the military and the government, if you think of it. The importance of restrictions. So this is good because it it minimizes insider threats because it supports the concept of the principle of least privilege. And then it's also great because you have regular access reviews, meaning that you check to see if someone is still required to remain within that permission set or if that needs to change. I think that covers it pretty succinctly. All right, one of the last slides here. Resilience and recovery. Now, when it comes to resilience and recovery, this is all in relation to, remember, resilience is if there's an incident, how fast can we bounce back? It's meant to understand how does this organization withstand any incidences, any failures, any attacks, anything like that. Okay. That's what resilience means. Recovery is how quickly can we bounce back from this event? Typically, this falls under the resilience team category. Under that resilience, you have disaster recovery, and then you have BCP. So, in essence, you want to set some really good measures in place to address that. Well, how do we do that? For one, if we want to be able to be resilient and bounce back quickly, we need to make sure that we have redundancy, we have backups, we have failover systems. We want to have duplicates of certain systems. We want to have certain powers and connections, such as the RAID I showed you before. We also want to make sure that we have a disaster recovery plan. Now, the disaster recovery plan means that everything is outlined properly and there's been testing done to ensure that we do it properly. So if there's a major incident, someone can already know, okay, we have to do XYZ. That kind of like falls into BCP's plan a little bit. And then you need to have a backup and restoration, not just restoration, but making sure you know what type of restoration you want to bring back, whether it's regularly, it's a full day, just one, and what have you. It's pretty multifaceted. Okay. Now, that's how you implement resilience and recovery. However, you have to also think of some of the considerations, right? So with a BCP, business continuity planning, you need to make sure that that involves all of the right information. Here's an example. When I was working on a BIA, which stands for Business Impact Analysis, you use the business impact analysis to understand a business's key business activities, meaning if a fire were to happen, what are the activities you need in order for your team to continue to function? The BIA gets fed into the business continuity plan. And then the BIA has sections in it that says, hey, we don't have a failover, we don't have a recovery system for this system or this incident. That's where disaster recovery come in and say, hey, I think we need to address that. Testing and simulation, this is as simple as like a tabletop exercise saying, hey, everyone's sitting here right now. We just had an earthquake. And so what is your team going to do? Hearing them talk through it and then finding any gaps. Communication and collaboration. This is important because when you're working in disaster recovery, you are really trying to protect everyone. So you need to be able to communicate, collaborate with other resources at all levels of the chain. All right, quiz time. Which regulation emphasized the protection of personal data and privacy for individuals within the EU and EAA? Quiz answers. Sorry, I didn't put a thread in there. The answer, all right, well done, everyone. That is the GDPR. Great job. I think we're going to go ahead and skip this quiz. Instead, we're going to do the quiz on Kahoot. But before we do that, let me go ahead and wrap up in the presentation here. So, in conclusion, we talked about data protection, what it is, what types of data are important. We talked about how encryption, access control, backups, and having a great secure design is really important. We also talked about how regulatory compliance was a big part in making sure that we have the right security tools in place to protect data. We talked about how 80% of security incidences happen because of the human factor. Now, that's not to say it was malicious. Sometimes it can be an accident. That being said, it's still important that we document all of this so that if there is a security audit or security assessment, we know what exactly happened and how to address it accordingly. And then we also talked about backups, okay? So all of these are really important. Like I mentioned before, the key things that you want to fully focus on from a knowledge standpoint as a cybersecurity professional, and especially for your exams, is asymmetric and symmetric encryption, why those are important. And you also, I would say, want to be familiar with when it comes to the regulations, making sure that you're familiar with the NIST framework. The NIST cybersecurity framework is going to be one of the most common frameworks you're going to run into. All right.